I avoided learning how to purl for 10 years because my brain is built differently. Hey guys, and welcome back. For this Sunday's vlog, I wanted to walk you through my typewriter cardigan because in true Arlie fashion, it has a whole backstory. This is not just a cardigan pattern. It's a story about problem solving, neurodivergence, and doing things differently. And honestly, just refusing to give up on knitting even when I was struggling to get through some basic concepts. And then, because I am the final nerd boss, we're gonna go into color pairing, color dominance, yarn behavior, stash busting, gauge math, and why I was steam blocking sections of this cardigan like an absolute menace while I was still knitting it. So let's grab our tea, let's grab our whips, and let's get into the chaos. Where did the typewriter stitch actually come from? The typewriter method was born from a very specific problem. And that problem was, it took me a really freaking long time to figure out how to purl. And that's because I have AuDHD, I'm dyslexic, and I'm left-handed, which is the most delightful cocktail of how can we make things as difficult as possible for me to learn them. When I first started learning how to knit, I discovered quickly that it was very instructional, and that's just not how my brain does things. Not because I wasn't trying hard enough or because I wasn't capable of learning, but because the standard way of teaching things just didn't line up with the way that I process information. And purling was one of those things that felt weirdly impossible to me for the longest time. I could knit just fine. It took me maybe a month to learn how to knit without looking at what I was doing. But the second I tried to purl, it just felt like everything was falling apart. So instead of learning in the conventional order, my brain did what I think a lot of neurodivergent brains do. And that was, it built a little bridge over the problem and created its own solution. And that is literally how this stitch was born. I wasn't sitting down trying to invent a new stitch per se. What I was actually trying to do was create the stockinette stitch effect without having to purl. I wanted all of those flat stitches on the surface and all the purl stitches on the back, and I was literally scraping the barrel of my brain trying to figure out how to do that. And somewhere along the way, the typewriter stitch emerged. So yeah. This cardigan is actually really special to me because it came from a place of frustration and curiosity. It came from a place of something that really didn't come easily. Honestly, I think that's a massive part of why I design at all. Because designing for me is a need to create these beautiful things I see while not actually knowing how to do it. So just problem solving it, documenting the process, finessing it, and then keeping it for myself for future reference. So I think that's a great segue to take a little moment to talk openly about being neurodivergent, because honestly it explains so much about how I knit and how I design. For me, being AuDHD with dyslexia means I learn through doing and experimenting and just inserting myself into the process and figuring it out as I go. It can mean a lot of trial and error and a lot of problem solving, and that can be really frustrating because I won't necessarily take the time to study the construction first. I'll just see it in my head, knit it out, see that I was absolutely wrong and have to frog that all back. But that does mean that I've got a lot of insight into fit because I've had a lot of practice. And for a long time, that actually made me feel like I was bad at knitting, which really made me quite sad because knitting is something that's helped me so much with my brain. I was getting so much serotonin from something that I appeared to be quite bad at. I was putting an expectation on myself that if I was a good knitter, I should be able to just learn these things really easily. You know, just understand the technique and move on. And that's just not true for everyone. Some of us genuinely learn sideways. Some of us learn through pattern recognition. Some of us learn through trial and error. And some of us learn by building entirely new systems that just make better sense to our brains. That is not a weakness. That is actually where innovation comes from. So the typewriter cardigan is also an example of my brain in yarn. Structured, unusual, problem solving, and playful. And I love that. What actually is the typewriter method? Let's get nerdy. The typewriter method is a sequence which is built around 3 colors that you work a strand at a time. And then you work them back all together. So you would have color A, and then you would have color B, and then you're going to have color C. You're going to work color A across. When you get to the end, you're literally just going to slide your needles back to the beginning again. You'll grab color B, and now we knit color B across. When you get to the end, you're just going to tighten up and neaten up those last stitches, and then you'll slide all the way back to the beginning of your needle. Grab your color C, and now we're going to work color C across. When you get to the end of the row, we do the same thing. We just tug these stitches and make them a little bit tighter. Then we just turn this around. We grab all three colors and we knit them all together back again. And what that does is create this really complex, multi-dimensional, layered colored work that honestly looks way more complicated than it really is. It's honestly so beginner friendly and so simple. It's all knitting and a bit of sliding, and then you repeat. And you can use whatever colors you like, so it keeps your brain active the whole time too. Also, because of this return row that creates this huge, big, pearly, ridge bump, the colors show up very differently depending on the sequence in which you choose them. And now that brings us smoothly into the conversation of color dominance and why color C is hiding. So the order in which you choose your colors matters a lot in terms of which color you want to be dominant in the fabric. Because while all three of them are used equally, one of them is not showing up much at all, and the other two are doing a huge amount of work. In this example, I've chosen three colors that would, on paper, go really well together. This one here has little flecks of red and yellow. Here we've got a yellow and here we've got a red. Also interesting to note, this is the thickest fiber of the three by far. It's also going to be the densest because this one is cotton. This one is baby alpaca and this one is a fuzzy baby suri. In the top half of this example, I put color A, the yellow color, last. And you can see it hides underneath these ridges. You almost can't see it at all. It's right underneath here. You can just barely see it popping out. You can, however, see it quite dominantly in the return rows because the yellow color is the densest and thickest fiber. It's pushing through in that mold effect. Now in the demonstration earlier, I put the yellow color first, and you can see here how it's pushing out completely. So in other words, row C is visually obscured by the return row where you knit all three back. And inversely, rows A and B are almost being pushed out a little bit and are really on display. So that's something I'd like you to know if you've got this pattern and you're busy planning out your colors. In this case, being intentional is really going to matter. If you want a color to really pop out, don't put it in that last row. Alternatively, if you've got a strand that's kind of a little bit odd one out, for example, if one of these was a lace mohair, maybe then you can hide it in row C because you really won't see much of that detail at all. Next, I'm going to talk about why this pattern is so great for stash busting. This cardigan or even the shawl is incredibly good for just using what you have. Because this fabric is made with the three strands held together, you can have a lot of fun with mixing and matching textures, colors, weights, even really odd quantities in a really forgiving way. You can be very intentional. So for example, this one, a blend of two mohairs and a baby suri. I've got three different kinds of fuzz. We've got suri fuzz, we've got a chunky mohair, and we've got a regular mohair. In this one, I used a Portuguese wool and I used three different natural grays that had some slight brown flecks. And in this one that I just finished, I used three highly variegated yarns, but in the same color area. This one is all baby suri. But you could mix a fluffy yarn with a very stable yarn. You can blend neutrals. You can throw in a strong contrast. You can even hide that contrast so it pops up like flecks. You can finally use up all those lonely little skeins. And because the result is such a mix match of all of these different colors, it creates this really visually rich texture. It's also got a really pretty wrong side. It creates this very interesting mold effect. It almost feels like painting with wool. But that's a good opportunity to talk about how different fibers behave differently. You know, my favorite subject. If you use a halo fiber like Surrey or mohair, you're going to get a softer, bloomier, drapier result. And you also may get some possible growth after blocking it. If you use something like cotton or linen, you're going to get something that's way more stiff, structured, heavier, and it's going to have less elasticity. If you use acrylic, it's going to hold its shape and it's going to be very predictable. It's just not going to bloom. Yes, it is stash friendly, but it's also one of those projects where swatching really matters. I'm going to give you a quick example. So like I mentioned, this is 1 part baby alpaca, 1 part Surrey fluff, and 1 part cotton. 2 of those fibers have a tendency to grow when they're blocked, and the one has a tendency not to grow at all. Right, so here we've got our little knitted out swatch. Currently she measures 9 centimeters. I use a little handheld fabric steamer, one of these. Okay, you can see she's a lot flatter already. And now she measures 10 centimeters. Okay, next up I'm going to explain to you how to make a swatch and then reverse method against my pattern. So let's say hypothetically you've made a little swatch and you've measured it out and you've measured that in 1 centimeter you get 2.5 stitches. And you've already decided you would like to go with the sizing where the back panel is 60 centimeters long. What you're going to do is you're going to multiply 2.5 by 60 centimeters. That's going to give you 150, and that's how many stitches you have to cast on with your little Renegade Rogue swatch to meet my same measurements. And I really like this for all of us because this pattern is so super simple. If you can just figure out the cast on, you can do whatever you like. It also makes sizing really inclusive because say I haven't catered for your size, you're smaller or a little bigger, you can actually just work out how long you want your cast on to be, and then we can cast on those stitches. So you don't have to go deep into the math void to figure out how to make this pattern fit you if you're trying to do something completely different. All you need to do is figure out how many stitches fit into 1 centimeter across and how big do I want it to be. Done. And then for the sleeves, the same logic really applies. So we've got our center ridge row where this line here, where we've now divided and gone into panel A and panel B in the front, this now acts as your anchor stitch for the shoulders. All you're going to want to do is look at the sizing metric on my chart and figure out exactly how big you want your armhole to be. Then you're going to figure out how many sets fit into that sizing. So for example, with the small sleeve over here, I needed to work over 26 sets. So I created my anchor ridge here with a stitch marker, and then I worked out 13 sets this way, 13 sets this way, and then I distributed my picked up stitches in between these sets. A note for my reverse engineering knitters that are watching this: if you go off and try and make it yourself without reading the pattern, you just want to make sure that you don't pick up stitch for stitch. You need to be picking up between 2 and 3 stitches per set over that entire section. I worked out a nice comfy rhythm, and that was 3 stitches, 3 stitches, 2 stitches, repeat. Yeah, this whole cardigan becomes really customizable, which I really love. I would still strongly advise that you steam block out each section as you go. So for example, knit out the back, steam it out, knit out your front panels, steam them out, because not to be dramatic, even though I am, I already knew the yarn could grow. And I didn't want any little surprises. So I knitted to a point where I thought I was close to reaching the measurement I wanted, but it was still short enough that there was a bit of room for it to grow. And then I measured it out and I steam blocked it so I could get an exact number of what my growth percentage looked like. For the baby alpaca, it got 7 centimeters of growth. This mohair Surrey blend has given me 5 centimeters of growth. And as we just saw with my other little experimental swatch, we got 1 centimeter of growth over there. And that was over quite a short range. There's only 7 sets here. So this really is going to give you a much truer idea of the dimensions, especially with halo yarns. This is very helpful, because sometimes stitches look one way on your needles and then after blocking it blooms, it relaxes and it opens up, and suddenly your sleeve is 7 centimeters longer than you expected it to be. So for me, steam blocking as I went was not just a finishing technique, it was part of the designing tool. it let me check my assumptions before I turned it into a full garment. And you can see that's relevant even if only 1 or 2 of your fibers are going to grow. Next, we're going to walk quickly through the pattern. The cardigan starts as one continuous torso panel. So we're going to cast on our back stitches and then we're going to go straight into the typewriter method, and we're going to knit out a little rectangle or a square until we reach the dimensions that we like, and then we split off and we keep one set of stitches here. For example, this one's 80 stitches all across. I put 40 stitches over here, I had 40 stitches over here, and then I just continued knitting out panel A. When I was done, I came back for panel B. So the construction is actually really simple, really straightforward, and really satisfying. Next up, for the sleeves, as I explained, we've got our anchor ridge going over here. We know that this is the center of the shoulder. We figure out exactly how long we want our sleeves to be. We measure that out and we count how many sets fall across this, and then we'll distribute them equally across the front and across the back. You will then pick up all of those stitches. Like I mentioned earlier, you want to make sure that you're distributing those picked up stitches 3, 3, 2, 3, 3, 2, around about that. And then you'll go straight back into the typewriter method, but this time we're going to do decreases. We do some gradual decreases immediately and we work them throughout the whole sleeve, very simple in the pattern until the cuff. You can see that decrease is a really, really nice downsizing. There's no need to add a cuff because the actual borders of the typewriter method are really attractive. That also means you don't need to add any ribbing or any borders on the front too, because as you can see, it looks really nice and it falls really flat. Once you've knit out your sleeves, you're simply going to come in from the bottom of the cuff and you're going to seam up the sides all the way to the armpit and then seam down the sides, joining the front and the back panel like this. You do that twice and then you're all done. That's literally it, guys. You work in any loose ends if you had any. This one is cropped, but you can go longer. I've made this one quite a lot longer than the other one. And then another fun little attribute about this pattern is you can mix and match the sleeve and torso sizes. So for example, with that pink one, I used a medium torso, and because I've got little arms, I went down to a small arm. So the whole thing feels really clean, really intuitive, and surprisingly stress-free once you understand my logic. Very little seaming, which is always appreciated. Absolutely no purling, which is a crowd pleaser. You can watch TV and knit this thing, but it looks like it was a very technical technique. But actually you were just meditating while doing repetitive sets. And lastly, in closing, I just wanted to say a little shout out to anyone who also is on the neurodivergent spectrum. If this can be a little example of how not to give up, and actually you've got a brilliant brain. I know that sometimes things can be really frustrating, but sometimes really beautiful things come out of that. Nothing is gained without experimentation. And if you can't do something, don't just accept that. It doesn't have to make sense to you now, but eventually it will. We all learn differently, we all see things differently, and we all build our own logic to make things click. So in a way, this cardigan is for all of you too. It's proof that the long road is actually the more scenic route, and you're gonna get somewhere really beautiful. And sometimes your workaround becomes your whole design. So guys, that's the whole story behind the typewriter cardigan. If you want to knit one yourself, the pattern is live on my website, Ollie Knits. And if you do make one, please tag me. I love to see how you all choose your different colors and all the different ways that it works out. I personally am probably gonna make a maxi one soon. Can you imagine? Like a whole long one. You can let me know in the comments if you enjoyed this story, if you want more stories like this, because honestly, they're some of my favorite videos to make. If you enjoyed this, please consider subscribing, liking, or letting me know your thoughts in the comments, because there could always be more yarn science, knitting patterns, neurodiverging knitting chaos coming your way. Thank you for spending some time with me, and I'll see you in the next one. Bye.